Let's rock. If you're new to the tribe, we got Rich behind the mix. Rad is across the table from me, and I am Yanni Burmeister. We are Unity Gym experts at turning driven people into athletes. This episode is brought to you by the Unify Movement System, the online program that balances strength, flexibility, and fitness so you can unleash your inner athlete. Get daily coaching by us, plus both our Epic Gym and Home UMS programs. As a valued listener, use the link in the description to get your first month free. Before we get started, I always like to give a big warm welcome if you're watching on YouTube. Remember to hit the like button. The more likes we get, the more people get to see this great, useful content. And always subscribe if you like what you see. I'm very excited to announce that joining us today, we have Phil White from ADPT Physio and Tony Battaji from tonybattaji.com.
And for those of you who didn't know, Tony started working in the fitness industry in 1995, first as a personal trainer and sports coach, and then moved into roles that included education, academia, and strength coaching. These days, Tony splits his time evenly between coaching one-on-one in the gym and running educational courses on many topics to do with training, program design, and body composition. He holds a PhD in sports science and has written more than 65,000 training programs and coached elite athletes in around 30 different sports. Tony, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here, guys.
And Phil, welcome to the show as well. It's always good to have you here.
Absolutely. Keen to get into it.
Yeah. This is a really good discussion that we've got today. Yanni, why don't you introduce the topic?
Yeah, this is last year in 2021, we threw out to the tribe what questions they had. So this is the Unity Gym Tribe Q&A podcast series where we answer your questions. Today we have a question from a bunch of the tribe. We had Patrick Offner, Martin Rose, Tim Hughes, Diane Norbury, Nick Eddy, and Helen Madge, all from the UMS online coaching group, ask for specific training tips to maintain muscle mass, strength, flexibility, and metabolism as you age. And the ages that they gave were 40, 50, and 65 plus. And we're also going to answer, in doing so, we're also going to answer a really great question from Jody Buttle from the UMS Movement Mastermind group, who asked, how should you train to avoid perimenopausal muscle loss and how to best cope with it mentally? These two questions have a lot. They're very related to one another. So let's throw it straight over to Tony and let's get your best training tips, both for men and women as you age, to maintain muscle mass, strength, flexibility, and metabolic function.
Well, huge question there with a lot of different avenues that we can go down. So firstly, let's look at aging and then what can be done about that. So typically, both males and females, muscle mass and muscle and strength peak at around 25 to 30. And then it stays relatively constant until we hit 50. And then from 50 onwards, we typically lose 1 to 2% of our muscle every year and about 3 to 4% of our strength. Now that stays pretty constant until we hit about 60, and then we get a sharper decline from 65, 70, and then by the time we're 80, then frailty syndromes start to kick in. Now research has shown that we tend to not lose our muscle and strength in a linear way. We tend to lose it during these periods called a catabolic crisis, and that's when we're bedridden with either injury or sickness, like the flu or COVID, where you're basically not doing anything for a week at a time. We lose chunks of our strength and muscle mass in these bouts. But interestingly, in the absence of that, muscle mass is pretty constant. But the only difference is for females who go through menopause, where they have marked changes in the hormone environment that is protective of muscle and bone, and also of metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. So the advice that we would give somebody in their 20s versus their 40s is exactly the same, dependent on your ability to recuperate. And that is, the older we get, the more time space we need before training sessions so that we can keep training productively rather than getting sore and potentially having injuries. So the age of 20, 30, 40s, pretty similar, just take into account recuperation ability. from 50 onwards, the argument should be that we focus more on strength and muscle mass, because that's the period of time where our muscles are more susceptible to being lost with periods of inactivity. And this is called anabolic resistance. And it works in two ways. Every time we perform an exercise session or eat protein-rich foods, that talks to our muscle mass to essentially start growth pathways, and we lay down more muscle mass, or we have more muscle growth. As we age, muscles become more anabolically resistant. And when we pass menopause, muscle becomes more anabolically resistant. So that means the amount of protein it takes to turn on muscle growth pathways and the amount of weight training that we do to get that happening as well is blunted a little bit. So that's why weight training and protein-rich foods become a real emphasis over the age of 50, as opposed to any other modality of exercise. And all exercise is important, of course, aerobic, anaerobic, but weight training speaks to muscle mass in a way that the others don't really do. So the big answer to the question, guys, is that the emphasis up to 50, nothing really changes. After 50, that's where there should be potentially a greater emphasis on weight training and protein-rich foods that talk together to preserve muscle mass.
Yeah, that's awesome, and such good advice for people, because we, sadly, we do see so many people rejecting the notion that regular weight training is a really important part of health and fitness and longevity. And I think it's a message that, as much as everybody in this room has heard enough to really sink in, I think the general population out there still are really not understanding the importance of this.
I think the one thing that we should emphasize, and this is something that I really like to emphasize with everybody, is that you've got a window of opportunity. You don't really find it appealing to sort of get into a gym and lift weights until you're in your later teens for men, and maybe women it's in your 20s. You sort of see that historically. And then you've got a window of opportunity. There's a little bit of time where you're figuring things out. And then I think from like 25 to 35, 40, I really would challenge everybody to try to make it a lifestyle practice as quickly as possible, so that you can sort of bank as many reps and as many days in the gym as possible, within reason, to put on as much muscle mass as possible in that period of time. Yeah. Because it becomes a little bit harder and harder with every year, I think. And that's not to do with just your physiology. That's to do with just lifestyle factors. The moment you have children to take care of and your career starts to become more and more demanding, you just tend to find more excuse not to get into a gym or not to find a barbell or a set of dumbbells and move them around as much. So I'm always just telling all of my friends and our community here at the gym, don't get too caught up in the finer principles of where you're going to get the 1% or 2%. Just build a habit of regular practice of resistance training and cardio training and flexibility training, so that by the time you need that routine, it's sort of really, really laid down and it's strong. It's something that has become a habit, a ritual, if you may.
Yeah, and supported by nutrition as well. But I really loved what you said there about was it catabolic events was the term you used? Is that right?
Yeah, so the term catabolic crisis is proposed by a group in the Netherlands, Luc van Loon's lab, that have done a lot of research on comatose patients and people experiencing bed rest. So they have access to a hospital 24/7 where they can go in and take samples of muscle during people who are comatose or who have limbs immobilized, and they drill through the cast, take samples of muscles. So a lot of what we know about aging muscle has actually come from his lab, because he's the one who's able to actually plot muscle changes, strengthen muscle changes over time. And he's the one to propose that it's actually not linear, because studies show from this age to this age, your strength and muscle are going to go down. So everyone's assumed it's linear, but he's shown that it's not. These catabolic crisis periods of bed rest and injury is what causes the major changes in muscle. And he's shown that 1 week of bed rest, 1 week, takes about 6 months of weight training experience to reverse. 6 months versus 1 week.
Yeah.
Wow.
I can vouch for that when I had my knee reconstruction.
Yeah,
after 5 days, like you sort of could almost on a day-to-day basis watch the quadriceps disappear.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it up because I had a patient just yesterday who was a 51-year-old man who'd had an ACL reconstruction, and his with ACL reconstructions these days, they get you mobilizing really early, weight bearing really early. The physio he'd been seeing before had done, strengthening exercise for the quad. Muscle mass was pretty good, but it kind of just missed any calf work in there. And he came in and he was just like, there is a crater where my calf used to be. Like, it was just amazing how, this was only he's had the surgery within the last about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And just from, he got the rest of the stuff right. The quads are looking pretty good, but the calf had just completely sort of cratered out on that medial side. And it was just amazing to see, when we look at these studies and they're talking about people who are, complete bed rest, lying down, not doing anything. Like, this guy is still, a functioning guy walking around, and it can really just happen. So he was also a vegetarian, which definitely didn't help the situation. And but it was just amazing to see someone who is also not just bed rest, but he's having a catabolic crisis.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tony, I've got a question for you on what you spoke about 1 week of bed rest. The muscle mass loss takes about 6 months to regain with resistance training. Are you this isn't even my question, but I just want for context. Are you talking about in elderly people or in anybody?
Yeah, in the older age. There's actually a number of data on this depending on the age bracket studied, but essentially subjects are tested both in the cross-sectional surface area of, say, the quadriceps, and then on a parameter of strength like a leg press, and then are put into a cast for a week, and then a strength trained 2 or 3 times a week until they get the same size back and the same strength back. And that period of time is months and months and months.
And are they trained or untrained individuals?
Oh, that's a good question. There's been a number of studies that have been done. In that population group, I believe that was a trained population group, but I would need to check to see. There's lots of detraining studies, both with people who are former athletes, recreationally trained, and sedentary.
Okay, so I've got this is really my question. Everything I just said there was to frame it. What's your opinion, your personal opinion on, let's say you're somebody that has gotten things right in the way that Yanni framed it, where, in your early 20s or mid 20s, you start going to the gym regularly 2, 3, 4 days a week doing resistance training. You put on, you're a man that goes from 70 kilos to 80 kilos of lean mass. And you then go through that 1 week of bed rest of immobilization. Do you think that same person can bounce back to where they were before that week of immobilization quicker with resistance training?
Yeah, the data, this comes down to this loose term muscle memory, and the data seems to show that it does exist, and most likely because you have more cells in muscle fibers in the myonuclei that recognize the tension placed on the muscle when you lift weights. So you will typically be able to return to your form faster than somebody who had equivalent amount of muscle but was untrained.
Yeah, which is a very important point to make, I think, if we're talking about this catabolic crisis thing. It's really relevant to understand that somebody that does have experience in training can deal with these catabolic crises better than the average person.
Yeah, and for it sounds pretty grim for people who are in this situation, and everyone has been sick and been in a similar thing where they just feel like you can't do anything. But do you have many thoughts about things like imaginary training or contralateral training if you do have an immobilized limb for maintenance of strength and muscle mass? Is that something you've looked into?
Yeah, first and foremost, you train what you can train. So this is now talking about injuries, because you can work around other limbs, and there is data to show that working the uninjured limb has a transference to the limb that is immobilized. Then I would focus on nutrition and emphasize regular protein feeding. So typically 20 to 30 grams for most average weight people, spread 3 or 4 times across the day. And recent data shows that omega-3 fatty acids also interacts with the protein to help maintain muscle mass and strength when an individual is injured. So that would be, I think, the most recent compelling data is 3.5 grams of marine lipids a day in conjunction with that protein. And I would also use neuromuscular electrical stimulation units like a Power Dot or a Compex. These things are portable, small, relatively inexpensive these days, and you can use those devices in conjunction with bed rest or around injuries.
Yeah, we talked about this in my sports science degree. We actually did a test where we're doing contralateral training, where we test both arms at the beginning, doing bicep curls, and then 6 weeks of just training your non-dominant hand, and then coming back, and you did see a strength increase in that other side, and that is because that neural drive aspect of when you're just teaching your brain to basically send more signal and activate these larger motor units. But yeah, when we're also looking at the idea of imaginary training, where basically like there was studies into even just imagining you're doing maximal efforts has a similar effect on increasing neural drive. And there was some science to show that actually increased or like maintained more muscle mass than people who didn't do this very intensive imaginary training. So I just thought it's a really interesting one. And for people who, are now really horrified about the idea of going into a catabolic crisis in the future, like just having some of these ideas about maybe things that you could do to try and minimize that effect. There's something there, but
absolutely. Just quickly circling back, Tony, the marine lipids, is it okay to get that through supplementation, a good fish oil supplement?
Yeah, that's typically what's used in the studies because it's standardized.
Yeah, and you can dose it perfectly. Yeah, absolutely. So just two more things I want to go. First of all, Patrick Offner, who was one of the people that was most interested in finding this out. He's a 65-year-old orthopedic surgeon in our online coaching group who obviously, as most surgeons, is a shift worker and can do very, very long periods of quite disruptive shift work. And he's Rad and I always joke about, if we look as good as he does at 65, I'll be very happy. He doesn't look like he's not a strong person. He's a very, very athletic looking person. Must be 6'2" or something like that, 6'1" at least. But what would you give as a specific tip? Where I want to end this is the difference between men and women, because we do know that the women perimenopausal muscle loss is something that is very real and probably a lot more dramatic and tangible than what the male at the same sort of age bracket will experience. First of all, what specific sort of tip would you give someone like Patrick, who's a shift worker, works very high stress as a surgeon, 65 years old, to maintain his muscle mass? Would it be training specific or a combination of protein dosage and training specific? And then how would you do that with a woman of the same sort of age post-menopause?
Yeah, the beauty of exercise is it covers for a number of sins. And data has shown that the exercise session, in particular weight training, can counteract some of the negatives that we see in sleep deprivation. And John Hawley is doing a lot of this research down in Victoria these days of looking at circadian changes or sleep restriction, and then to see what happens to muscle growth or muscle protein synthesis. We know for decades it's blunted. There's a 10 to 15% reduction in testosterone when you've undergone 5 nights of sleep restriction. And that's just a few hours less. So that's not even dramatic. So what Hawley and his colleagues are starting to show is that exercise can override some of the negatives that we see with sleep restriction. So that would be one. And obviously it sounds like he's already onto that. What we see with menopause is that the protective effect of estrogen is no longer there. And therefore its effect on bone, muscle mass, and insulin sensitivity is you're no longer able to use that. So you have to artificially induce it with exercise. One session of exercise improves insulin sensitivity and GLUT transporters. So the GLUT transporter that takes carbohydrate into the muscle cell or into the liver is upregulated. So that's one session of exercise. So you have to exercise regularly. The effect on bone and muscle mass has to be, again, artificially induced with resistance training. So you have to say, right, well, I don't have the effect of estrogen anymore, but weight training, resistance training, then upregulates muscle protein synthesis. So that's what you want. So post-menopause, you have to use exercise as your medication. And we use weight training for bone and muscle, and we use aerobic training for insulin sensitivity. In fact, all exercise improves insulin sensitivity, but the health of the mitochondria. And then you can keep progressing into your later years, confidently knowing that you're doing the best thing for bone, muscle, and insulin sensitivity.
And just quickly on that, do people need to do long bouts of steady state cardio, or can you get the same benefit or an okay benefit from doing shorter bouts of interval training for that mitochondrial health?
There's certainly crossovers. There's no question. Interval training has been shown to maximally improve the expression of many mitochondrial markers of its growth and of its function. But at the same time, what steady state is doing is it's causing the maximal use of enzymes involved in both carbohydrate and fat metabolism with a very easy exercise stimulus that doesn't overly tax the neuromuscular and the central nervous system. So they are different, and you can't use one and not the other. You can't just do interval training and not steady state, because you're going to miss those enzymes involved in carb and fat burning. And you can't just do zone 2 or steady state exercise, because then you're going to miss that top end VO2 benefits and the expression of mitochondrial function. So you do need both, and you do need to do them with a degree of regularity so you keep the enzyme pathways alive and active, because muscle is highly plastic and malleable. So as soon as you take a week off an exercise stimulus, you start to go backwards. So it needs to be done with regularity and consistency.
And just a similar question, but now looking at bone, I think that impact has such a bad name in for a lot of people. They think they get really scared of impact and like, oh, I shouldn't, I should stop running. I should get I should only use swimming. It's low impact. That's good for me, right? But you're talking there about bone stimulus from resistance exercise. But how do you feel about impact versus resistance exercise for bone health? And that's just really important for post-menopausal women, especially with risk of osteopenia.
It's a very important question. Yeah, it's a very important question. And we have a number of different stresses or pathways by which bone is then forced to have a greater deposition of bone as opposed to more breakdown. And we have impact that occurs with jumping, skipping, running. And then we've got tensile forces placed on the bone that occurs with weight training, either just pure compression of the bone or the bending of the bone that occurs, say, when you bow forward during a deadlift or a good morning, a back extension. So either way, we need a multiple approach, a multifaceted approach to looking at bone. We want high impact, running, skipping, jumping, and we want weight training that stresses the bone in a different way to pure compression. And the idea that we should avoid these high impact, it's going to lead us down the road of, well, what happens to swimmers' bones? And what happens to cyclists' bones? They're all osteopenic, if not osteoporotic. So that's why we want nutrition to provide enough raw materials to be sent to bone, and then enough of a stimulus or this mechanotransduction that takes the load and sends it to the bone.
Brilliant. And the final thing, and which was also part of Jody's original question, from a psychological standpoint. I know that none of us are qualified psychologists here, but we can certainly give a little bit of insight or encouragement around what to focus on if you are a woman dealing with menopause, knowing that I'm if I don't exercise, I'm going to lose a lot of my muscle mass. exercise, we've made very clear, is the medicine. From a psychological standpoint, what encouraging words would you give a female client just to get their head in the right spot so they don't feel sort of a sense of hopelessness dealing with that period of life?
Ultimately, not being a psychologist, my job is to educate and inform. And that's what we do as coaches. So we prescribe the sets and the reps, but we also explain the why. And a lot of the public, especially peri and postmenopause, they don't understand exercise as medicine. And many coaches don't. They know the sets and the reps, but they don't know how it affects bone and how it affects muscles, or knowing what physiologically is happening to a female as they go through these changes. So what I do is I explain to them, this is what you're going through, and this is what exercise does to counteract the effect of estrogen on bone, the effect of estrogen on your GLUT transporters and insulin sensitivity, and on your muscle mass. And if you don't do X, Y, Z, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think that we've given a very, very strong argument to why it is so important for both men and women as you age to exercise, but also for younger men and women to bank that time to build those healthy habits and to prepare yourself, because you never really know. And I really like the fact that we've highlighted these periods of time that are really unpredictable, like myself having a soccer injury and needing a knee reconstruction, that make it extremely hard to be consistent. You know, we like to think that we're building habits that are consistent throughout our life, but, you know, life always sort of throws you a curveball when you least expect it. And I think the best medicine for that is to just do as much as you can when you can.
Yeah, and it's something that I'm really hoping that physio sort of changes, where I think there's kind of been a tendency to really zoom in on acute stuff and basically take people out of their activity while they do very low load rehab exercises. And I'm really hoping and I'm pushing for people to really see injuries as an opportunity to then work on other parts of their body that maybe they don't do. They don't train regularly or don't have much intention towards, and then like using it as a kind of launch pad to find another bit of enthusiasm for training, because these times when people get injuries and duck out of training are these catabolic crises that can just really go downhill. So I encourage you to, if you're working with a health professional that tells you to stop everything, maybe get a second opinion.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Tony, for joining us again. If you're interested, you can Tony can be found on Twitter at Tony Boutagy, TonyBoutagy, for interesting articles he's read, or on Instagram at Tony Boutagy for more training related information. And remember that you can enroll in any of Tony's amazing coaching courses at tonyboutagy.com. We highly recommend them. They are a massive influence on our UMS program. Thanks so much for joining us again, Tony, and we look forward to having you on the show again really soon.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Phil.
Cheers.